In 1405, a fleet of 317 ships sailed out of the port of Nanjing. The flagship alone stretched over 400 feet, longer than a football field. To put that in perspective, when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic 87 years later, his largest ship, the Santa Maria, was barely 85 feet long. You could park 5 Santa Marias on the deck of a single Chinese treasure ship and still have room left over. This was the armada of Admiral Zheng He. 27,000 soldiers, sailors, translators, doctors, and astronomers, a floating city powered by the wealthiest civilization on the planet. At the time, China's economy produced roughly 30% of the entire world's GDP. The Ming dynasty had more silver in its treasury, more soldiers under arms, and more advanced naval technology than every European kingdom combined. They had the means to colonize every coastline they touched. They had the firepower to crush any resistance. And over the course of 7 epic voyages, spanning 28 years, they reached Vietnam, Java, India, the Persian Gulf, and the eastern shores of Africa. They planted 0 flags. They claimed 0 colonies. They enslaved 0 people. And then, a few decades later, the emperor ordered every ocean-going ship dismantled. The construction blueprints were set on fire. It became a criminal offense to build a vessel with more than 2 masts. A superpower that could have conquered the world chose to erase its own navy from existence. Why? Welcome to Silk Road Annals. Today, we are going to decode one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in human history: the empire that China refused to become. And what we uncover will fundamentally change how you understand the geopolitics unfolding right now in the 21st century. Part 1. The Road Not Taken. Before we unravel the why, let us fully grasp the magnitude of the what if. Between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He commanded the largest naval expeditions the world had ever seen. His treasure ships, the Baochuan, were engineering marvels, equipped with watertight bulkhead compartments, a technology Europe would not adopt for another 4 centuries. They carried magnetic compasses refined over generations, stern post rudders that allowed astonishing maneuverability for their size, and a system of rotating crews that kept the fleet operational for months at sea without resupply. While Europe was still building coastal vessels that hugged shorelines and prayed they would not capsize in open water, China had already mastered deep ocean logistics on an industrial scale. Zheng He's fleet docked in the ports of Calicut, Hormuz, Mogadishu, and Malindi. Foreign rulers were stupefied. The Sultan of Malindi sent back a live giraffe as tribute, an animal so bizarre to Chinese eyes that the imperial court initially declared it a qilin, a mythical creature whose appearance supposedly signaled the reign of a perfectly virtuous emperor. The propaganda value alone was immense. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. During those 7 voyages, not a single colonial governor was installed. No fortified trading post was constructed. No local population was forced into labor. China showed up with overwhelming power, distributed silk, porcelain, and gold, collected symbolic tribute and exotic curiosities, and then they sailed home. Now consider the counterfactual. Imagine Zheng He had turned his fleet westward in 1421 and kept going. The largest European navy at the time could muster perhaps 50 to 60 ships. China had over 300. They would have arrived on the coast of Portugal like a tidal wave hitting a fishing village. The Portuguese exploration of the African coast, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, Columbus's stumbling upon the Americas, the entire age of discovery, all of it could have been preempted or erased before it began. The Atlantic slave trade, the colonization of the New World, the extraction of Aztec and Incan gold that financed European empires for centuries, the industrial exploitation of India, All of these world-shaping events hung on one hinge, that China chose to stay home. That single decision, or rather, that single refusal, is arguably the most consequential geopolitical choice in the last 1,000 years of human history. So why did they make it? The answer is not simple. It is layered, like Chinese civilization itself, and it begins with geography. Part 2. The land that needed nothing. Nations do not explore the unknown out of curiosity. They explore out of desperation. Portugal did not send ships around Africa because its kings were adventurous dreamers. They sent ships because Portugal was a tiny, resource-poor strip of land on the edge of Europe, boxed out of the overland trade routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and they needed spices, gold, and new markets to survive. Spain crossed the Atlantic because it needed silver, badly. Britain turned India into a colony because it wanted cheap cotton, tea, and indigo to feed its growing industrial machine. European colonialism was born from scarcity. China had no such scarcity. Historians sometimes describe the pre-modern Chinese Empire as a self-contained universe. The territory of the Ming dynasty stretched from the tropical rice paddies of Guangdong in the south to the frigid wheat fields of Manchuria in the north, from the Pacific coastline deep into the deserts of Central Asia. Within these natural borders, shielded by the Himalayas to the southwest, the Gobi Desert to the north, and thousands of miles of ocean to the east, existed virtually every climate zone, every crop, and every mineral resource a pre-industrial civilization could need. Rice from the Yangtze Delta fed hundreds of millions. Iron and coal deposits fueled metalworking centuries ahead of Europe. Vast salt reserves, limitless timber, and three products that the rest of the world was desperate to buy but could not produce: silk, tea, and porcelain. For centuries, the global trade balance tilted overwhelmingly in China's favor. Silver flowed into China from all directions, from Japanese mines, from Spanish galleons carrying Peruvian silver across the Pacific, because the rest of the world had almost nothing that China actually wanted to buy. This was the core asymmetry. Europe went overseas because it had to. China stayed home because it could. But let us be precise here, because oversimplification is the enemy of truth. China was not entirely self-sufficient. It relied on horses from the Central Asian steppe for its cavalry. It imported aromatics and spices from Southeast Asia. Silver itself became an addiction that would later destabilize the economy. The point is not that China lacked nothing. The point is that nothing China lacked was desperate enough to justify the colossal risk of permanent overseas expansion. And the risks were not abstract. They were burned into the memory of every emperor who ever sat on the dragon throne. Part 3. The trauma that shaped 4,000 years. If you want to understand why China turned inward, you must understand the one fear that has haunted Chinese civilization since its very beginning. Not invasion, not plague, not famine, fragmentation. Chinese history is not a single continuous story. It is a cycle of unification and collapse, repeated over and over, each cycle leaving scars so deep they altered the civilization's DNA. Consider the Warring States period, from roughly 475 to 221 BC. For 2.5 centuries, 7 major kingdoms waged total war against each other across the Chinese heartland. This was not chivalric jousting or border skirmishing. It was industrial-scale slaughter. The Battle of Changping in 260 BC ended with the Qin army reportedly burying 400,000 surrendered Zhao soldiers alive. In a single battle. Whether the exact number is exaggerated or not, the scale of killing was civilizationally traumatic. Or consider the fall of the Han dynasty and the Three Kingdoms era that followed, roughly 220 to 280 AD. the population of China collapsed from an estimated 56 million to approximately 16 million. 7 out of every 10 people gone. Not from a natural disaster, not from a pandemic, from internal war. Chinese killing Chinese. Fast forward to the An Lushan rebellion of 755 AD during the Tang dynasty. Census records suggest the empire's population dropped from 53 million to 17 million in less than a decade. Even accounting for displacement and inaccurate counts, the death toll was staggering, potentially the single deadliest conflict in human history relative to world population at the time. More destructive, proportionally, than both world wars. Every single cycle of fragmentation produced the same lesson. When China is unified, it thrives. When China fractures, tens of millions die. This lesson was not merely remembered, it was elevated into a moral philosophy. In the Confucian bureaucratic tradition that governed Chinese politics for over 2,000 years, the supreme duty of the emperor was not conquest, it was harmony. A good emperor was measured by full granaries, functioning canals, peaceful borders, and a stable hierarchy of scholar officials managing the realm. Military adventure was not glory, it was gambling with the survival of civilization. And there was a very specific, very practical reason emperors feared military adventure. Every time a Chinese general won too many victories far from the capital, he accumulated power, loyal soldiers, territorial control, prestige. And when a general became too powerful, history showed he came back and seized the throne. The precedent was everywhere. Cao Cao effectively ended the Han dynasty with his military power. The Sui dynasty fell when its emperor overextended military campaigns into Korea. The Tang dynasty fractured after regional military governors gained too much autonomy. If you are a Ming emperor, the calculus is simple. Sending massive fleets to colonize distant lands means empowering admirals and generals with enormous resources, far from your oversight. The potential reward is some exotic territory you do not need. The potential cost is your throne, your dynasty, and another century of civil war that kills a third of your population. The voyages of Zheng He were cancelled not because China was weak. They were cancelled because the bureaucratic establishment convinced the new emperor that the voyages were dangerous, not to the sailors, but to the political stability of the empire itself. But here is the crucial distinction. Turning inward did not mean turning passive. China still wanted to dominate its world. It simply chose a radically different method, one that required no armies, no colonies, and no permanent overseas presence. Part 4. The greatest geopolitical con in history. While Europe was perfecting the art of military conquest, occupation, and resource extraction, China invented an entirely different operating system for projecting power. Western historians call it the tributary system. The Chinese called it Tianxia, all under heaven. Here is how it worked. Neighboring states, Korea, Vietnam, Siam, the Ryukyu Kingdom, various Malay sultanates, and dozens of others, would periodically send diplomatic envoys to the Chinese capital. Upon arrival, the foreign king or his representative performed the kowtow, 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations before the Chinese emperor, acknowledging him as the Son of Heaven, the supreme ruler of the civilized world. To Western sensibilities, this sounds like abject submission. But look at what happened next. In exchange for this ritual humiliation, the Chinese emperor would formally recognize the foreign ruler's legitimacy. He would bestow a royal title and an imperial seal, essentially a certificate of sovereignty backed by the most powerful state in Asia. For a small king surrounded by rivals, this Chinese endorsement was political gold. It told your enemies, "Attack me, and you attack the Son of Heaven." Then came the economics. The emperor showered the visiting envoys with gifts: silk, gold, lacquerware, porcelain, that were consistently and deliberately worth far more than whatever tribute the foreigners had brought. A Ryukyuan delegation might arrive with a modest shipment of sulfur and horses and leave with a fortune in Chinese luxury goods. And finally, participation in the tributary system granted access to the Chinese market, the largest, wealthiest consumer economy on the planet. Let us be concrete. The Ryukyu Kingdom, a small chain of islands between Japan and Taiwan, maintained tributary relations with China for over 500 years. It was, by any rational measure, the best deal in international relations. The Ryukyuans built their entire economy on being the middlemen of the China trade. They stayed independent, prosperous, and culturally autonomous in exchange for a ceremonial bow. Korea kept its own language, its own monarchy, its own artistic traditions. Vietnam kept its. China did not send administrators to govern their affairs. It did not extract forced labor. It did not redraw their borders. Compare this to what was happening on the other side of the world. By the 1500s, the Spanish were melting down Aztec temples for gold. The Portuguese were building slave forts on the West African coast. The British would soon reorganize the entire Indian subcontinent to serve as a raw materials supplier for Manchester textile mills. The European model was conquer, govern, extract, repeat. The Chinese model was overawe, legitimize, trade, and let the economic gravity of the Middle Kingdom do the rest. It was hegemony without the overhead, empire without the empire. But there was a fatal flaw embedded in this brilliant system. When you spend 1,000 years as the undisputed center of civilization, when every nation you interact with literally bows before you, you develop an almost narcotic sense of superiority. And when you believe you are the center of the universe, you stop paying attention to what is happening at the edges. In the 19th century, something arrived at those edges that the tributary system had absolutely no mechanism to handle. Part 5. The wound that never healed. The confidence that had insulated China for a millennium became almost overnight its greatest vulnerability. In the early 1800s, the British East India Company had a problem. Britain was importing enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wanted almost nothing from Britain in return. Silver was hemorrhaging out of the British economy. The trade deficit was unsustainable. The solution Britain found was opium. Grown in British-controlled India, smuggled into China by private traders, opium created millions of addicts and reversed the flow of silver almost overnight. When the Chinese government attempted to enforce its own drug laws and confiscated 20,000 chests of opium in Canton in 1839, Britain declared war. The First Opium War was not a contest. Britain deployed steamships, vessels that could sail against the wind and up rivers, rendering China's coastal fortifications useless. Chinese war junks, some of them designs unchanged for centuries, were blown apart. The Qing dynasty, which had spent its defense budget preparing for land invasions from the northern steppe, had almost no answer to modern naval warfare. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the first of what the Chinese still bitterly call the unequal treaties. Hong Kong was ceded. 5 ports were forced open. Extraterritorial rights meant that British citizens in China were not subject to Chinese law. The concept of Tianxia, all under heaven, was shattered, and it got worse. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, a joint British-French expeditionary force marched to Beijing and burned the old summer palace, the Yuan Ming Yuan. This was not a military installation. It was a vast complex of gardens, lakes, temples, and art collections, described by those who saw it as the single most magnificent architectural achievement in Asia. Inside were irreplaceable treasures accumulated over centuries: Tang Dynasty paintings, Song Dynasty porcelain, manuscripts, gold, jade. The soldiers looted everything they could carry, and then, on the orders of Lord Elgin, set the entire complex on fire. It burned for 3 days. Victor Hugo, upon hearing the news, wrote a letter calling it an act of barbarism committed by 2 civilizations against a third. The ruins still stand in Beijing today. They have never been rebuilt. They are kept deliberately as a scar, a permanent reminder. What followed was half a century of cascading humiliation. France took Vietnam, once a loyal tributary state. Japan, newly modernized, crushed China in the War of 1895 and seized Taiwan and Korea. Germany claimed a sphere of influence in Shandong. Russia pushed into Manchuria. The proud center of the Sino-centric universe was carved up like a melon at a banquet, its own metaphor for what was happening. The Chinese call this era the century of humiliation, from the First Opium War in 1839 to the Communist Revolution in 1949. In those 110 years, China went from being the civilization that the world bowed before to being called the sick man of Asia. This is not ancient history. This is living memory. The grandmother of someone alive today in Beijing may have personally witnessed foreign soldiers on Chinese soil. The psychological wound is generational, and it forged a single, unshakable vow at the heart of modern Chinese nationalism. Never again. Never again will China be weak. Never again will China be humiliated. And never again will foreign powers dictate terms to the Middle Kingdom. Which raises an urgent question about the present day. Part 6. The Invisible Empire. China has re-emerged. It is now the world's second largest economy. Its military budget is the second highest on Earth. Its technological capabilities rival or exceed those of any nation. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure program spanning over 140 countries, China is pouring money into ports, railways, power plants, and telecommunications networks across Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The Western narrative is that this is colonialism with Chinese characteristics. Politicians and commentators in Washington, London, and Brussels warn of debt trap diplomacy, the claim that China deliberately lures developing nations into taking massive, unpayable loans for infrastructure projects, and when the borrowing country inevitably defaults, China seizes strategic assets, effectively buying sovereignty on the installment plan. It is a powerful narrative, and there are elements of truth in it. But the full picture is more complicated, and intellectual honesty demands we examine it carefully. Take the case most often cited, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. The standard Western version is that China lent Sri Lanka money for a port nobody needed. Sri Lanka could not repay, and China seized the port. But dig deeper, and the story changes shape. The Hambantota project was championed by Sri Lanka's own president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, for domestic political reasons. It was in his home district. When Sri Lanka later faced a broader debt crisis, only about 10% of its external debt was owed to China. The majority was owed to Western capital markets and multilateral institutions like the IMF. The port was not seized. It was leased for 99 years in a deal that Sri Lanka's government negotiated, and Sri Lanka retained sovereign ownership. Is that a comfortable arrangement? No. Does it give China significant strategic leverage? Absolutely. But is it colonialism in the way that the British Raj was colonialism, or the way the Belgian Congo was colonialism? That comparison collapses under scrutiny. Researchers at institutions including Johns Hopkins University's China-Africa Research Initiative have systematically examined Chinese lending across the African continent. Their findings consistently show that Chinese lending has been fragmented, often driven by the demands and political agendas of the recipient governments. And when defaults have occurred, Chinese lenders have more often renegotiated, restructured, or written off debts than seized sovereign assets. At the same time, let us not be naive. Debt restructuring is not charity. Forgiving a loan or extending its terms can create a long-term dependency that serves Chinese interests perfectly well. A country that owes its port, its railway, and its telecommunications network to Chinese state-backed firms is a country that will think very carefully before voting against Beijing at the United Nations. China currently maintains exactly one overseas military base in Djibouti. The United States maintains over 750. While Europe and America historically built empires through military occupation and direct political governance, China is building something different. A web of economic interdependencies so dense that opposing Beijing becomes an act of self-harm for the nations caught within it. It is, in a very real sense, the tributary system reborn for the 21st century. The form is different. Instead of kowtows and imperial seals, there are bilateral infrastructure agreements and development loans. Instead of silk and porcelain, there are 5G networks and high-speed rail. But the underlying logic is identical. China positions itself at the center of a hierarchical economic network. Participating nations trade symbolic deference for access to Chinese capital and markets, and China achieves influence without the bleeding costs of military occupation. The language has even been preserved. Where the Ming emperors spoke of harmony under heaven, Beijing now speaks of win-win cooperation and a community with a shared future for mankind. The words are different, the architecture is the same. Part 7. The question that has no answer yet. So what kind of power is China trying to become? We have spent 500 years living in a world shaped by the European model of empire, territorial conquest, political governance of foreign peoples, military enforcement. This model is so deeply embedded in our imagination that we unconsciously assume it is the only way a great power can project itself onto the world stage. China is testing a different hypothesis. Can you achieve global primacy without governing a single foreign citizen? Can you build an empire made entirely of roads, ports, fiber optic cables, and debt obligations? Can economic gravity replace military force as the primary instrument of hegemony? The answer is genuinely unclear. History offers no precedent for what China is attempting at this scale. The tributary system worked in a pre-modern world where communication took months and alternatives were few. The modern world has instant information, competing powers, and populations that are acutely aware of power dynamics. Nations that accept Chinese infrastructure today may resist Chinese influence tomorrow. The system requires a level of sustained economic growth that may not be sustainable. And there are flashpoints: Taiwan, the South China Sea, the border with India, where the logic of economic interdependence collides with the raw, ancient logic of territorial sovereignty. The European colonial empires all discovered, eventually, that empires built on extraction collapse when the cost of maintaining them exceeds the value extracted. China may discover that empires built on debt and infrastructure face their own version of the same reckoning. But here is what is certain. 600 years ago, an admiral stood on the deck of the largest ship the world had ever seen, looked out at an ocean that was his for the taking, and turned around. Today, Chinese container ships carry more goods across the world's oceans than those of any other nation. Chinese construction firms are building highways in Kenya, bridges in Bangladesh, and rail lines through the mountains of Laos. Chinese satellites map the Earth. Chinese fiber optic cables span the ocean floor. The ships came back, but they are not carrying silk and porcelain as gifts for awestruck foreign kings. They are carrying concrete, steel, and contracts. The question is no longer whether China will cross the ocean. That question was answered. The question, the one that will define the century we are living in, is what kind of world they are building on the other side, and whether the rest of the world will choose to live in it. If you want to keep unraveling the hidden threads that connect the ancient East to the modern West, join us here at Silk Road Annals. History is not just the past, it is the map to our future. I will see you in the next one.